The mud on his hands wasn't just wet earth, it was memory. It was wisdom passed down through silence, shape, and season. As Waketa smoothed the last curve of the outer wall with a stone shaped like a crescent moon, the settlers across the field howled with laughter. One of them even fell from his porch, clutching his stomach as he pointed toward the squat, earthen dome rising from the frost-bitten valley. "Looks like a badger hole," they called out. "Even the dogs won't live in that thing. What's he going to do when the rains come, or snow?" Waketa didn't answer. He had learned long ago that thunder never explained itself before the storm. His home, barely taller than a man and rounded like the back of a buffalo, had taken him 3 moons to build. Not with tools of iron or planks of milled wood like the settlers favored, but with reed mats, willow ribs, thick straw, and earth soaked, stomped, and packed by hand. Mud, they called it. But to Waketa, it was medicine. It breathed when the cold came, held warmth like a mother's arms, and held still when the wind screamed through the valley. The settlers' cabins towered with pride, flat roofs, sharp corners, gaps sealed with tar or pitch. Waketa had watched them from a distance, men sawing, hammering, shouting, swearing, when beams cracked or roofs caved under the weight of a snowfall. One cabin even collapsed under its own ambition when the thaw came early last spring. Still, they pointed and mocked. But he remembered his grandfather's words. They build like they're trying to fight the land. We build like we're listening to it. That first night in the new lodge, Waketa built a small fire at the center pit, feeding it slow with bark and sage. The smoke curled gently up through the vent he'd carved near the top, drawn out by the slope of the walls, not forced, not rushed, just guided. The earthen shell held the heat like a buried coal, radiating back into the fur-lined bed where he lay curled with a bowl of boiled cattail roots and dried venison. Outside, the wind shifted. He could hear the logs of the settler cabins creak and pop, but inside, the world was still. The laughter had stopped hours ago, and in the stillness, as the snow began to fall, Waketa closed his eyes not with worry, but with peace, because he knew something they didn't yet. The joke wasn't the hut. The joke was thinking you could outbuild nature with sharp edges and stubborn pride. And when the storms came, not if, but when the valley would learn the difference. The snow came early. By the second week of leaf fall, the wind rolled in from the northern ridges, dragging frost and silence in its wake. It wasn't the polite snow, the kind that dances down like feathers and kisses the earth. It was the heavy kind, the kind that buried axes in logs and turned morning breath into smoke. The kind that whispered, "Now we'll see what lasts." The settlers rushed. They jammed wool into the gaps of their cabin walls, hammered shingles tighter, sealed windows with waxed cloth and desperate hands. From his doorway, Waketa watched them scramble, watched them argue over woodpiles and crack open barrels of salted meat too soon. They were already burning more than they could afford. Inside his lodge, Waketa moved slower. He stacked his firewood near the pit dry, split, and seasoned. The curved walls, thick with straw and soil, absorbed the cold instead of fighting it. The ground stayed warm from the coals he banked each night beneath ash. When he lay down to sleep, the thick hide stretched across the entry kept the wind outside where it belonged. On the third night of storm, the valley howled. The wind tore at the cabins. One lost its roof, another lost a wall. A baby cried all through the night in the settler house closest to the creek. Waketa heard it through the storm, sharp and desperate, like a wounded bird. He rose before dawn, took hot broth in a bark bowl, and walked through thigh-deep snow toward the sound. The woman who opened the cabin door had blue lips and shaking hands. Her husband stood behind her with a cracked axe handle and eyes that had run out of pride. Waketa didn't speak. He didn't scold. He handed her the broth. She took it like it was fire. Back in his lodge, the warmth still held. The walls didn't creak. The roof didn't leak. The air smelled of cedar smoke and damp earth, not mold, not panic. He placed another log on the coals and sat by the fire, the bowl now empty, the snow now thick. Outside, another storm brewed. Inside, not a draft stirred. And still, the laughter did not return, because now they had begun to notice. The hut they mocked had not cracked. The man they dismissed had not suffered. And the mud they joked about was the only thing in the valley that hadn't failed. By the fourth storm, the valley began to groan. Snow slid off mountain spines like river water down rock. Trees cracked in half under ice. The wind made no sound, at times just pressure, like an invisible hand trying to crush everything flat. The settlers' cabins, so proud and angular when autumn leaves still danced in the breeze, now resembled battered crates washed ashore after a storm. It started with the smallest one, a one-room cabin built by a young couple from east of the river. They were kind, wide-eyed, and newly-wed, but they had built too fast, too light, and too high. When the snow settled thick across their roof, the beams gave with a sound that split the valley open. The roof fell inward like a sigh. No one was hurt. They were at the stream when it happened, but the shame lingered longer than the fear. They came to Weketa that night, quiet, eyes lowered. He opened his door without a word, shared his broth again. They didn't ask about the mud. Not yet. But their glances traced the curve of his walls, the way the smoke rose true, the way no frost kissed, the inside of his dome. The next day, another cabin cracked. Not a full collapse, just a corner post that twisted from too much melt too fast. The ground had shifted under it. The men inside spent the whole day trying to wedge stones beneath it, but every hour brought more drip, more sag, more creak. Weketa walked past them on his way to gather wood. One of the men muttered, "Bet your mud's feeling real clever now." Weketa only nodded, not smug, not cruel, just still. That evening, at the edge of his firelight, he saw the boy from the broken cabin, the younger one crouched beside a patch of exposed soil, digging with a stick, pressing snow into it, watching how it moved, learning. Weketa didn't interrupt, because that's how it begins, not with pride, but with quiet questions. By mid-season, 3 cabins had failed. A fourth had a chimney fire, and still Weketa's lodge stood, its rounded form shrugging off the snow like a bear beneath a blanket. It wasn't magic. It was shape. It was breath. It was humility built into architecture, the idea that you don't resist the season, you fold into it. The settlers, once loud with laughter, now whispered when they passed. They called it the dirt dome, the winter egg, the strange one's hut. But more and more, they didn't say it with mockery. They said it with wonder. And that, Weketa knew, was the first step. At first they came at night, not with tools, just with eyes. Weketa would hear them in the snow, the soft crunch of boots trying not to crunch, the hush of coats rubbing against willow. They'd stayed just long enough to walk the perimeter of the lodge, sometimes circling twice. Once he heard the scratch of someone scraping a fingertip against the outer wall, as if trying to understand how it held shape at all. He never went out, never chased them off. Curiosity was not a trespass. By the second moon of snow, one of them, the boy from the fallen cabin, showed up in daylight. He didn't knock, just stood outside the doorway holding a bundle of grass and a question on his face. "How does it stay warm?" Weketa didn't answer with words. He stepped aside and let the boy in. Inside, the boy's eyes widened. The fire pit glowed steady. The roof did not drip. The walls curved smooth and brown, like river stone. Warmth clung to the air like breath to fur. Weketa handed him a bowl of broth, then placed a handful of straw into the boy's palm. "Feel it," he said. "Then soak it, then stomp it, then shape it." The boy didn't pretend to understand, but he nodded. Over the next week, Weketa noticed patches of straw missing from his old winter stock, not stolen, just taken in pieces, carefully, respectfully. He let it be. Then came the first attempt. Behind the settler cabins, near the creek bed, a low mound of earth began to rise, misshapen, too narrow, cracking already. But it was a beginning, a mud hut or something like. It was being built by foreign hands. One night, Weketa approached while the boy worked. The walls had slumped after the frost. The roof sagged. The fire inside had smoked out the entire dome. Weketa knelt beside the boy. "Why did yours not fall?" the boy asked. "Because I did not build it alone," Weketa replied. The boy looked around, confused. "I mean the earth," Weketa said, touching the frozen ground. "The snow, the breath of wind. You must let them help." The boy stared at him. And for the first time, Weketa saw something shift not in the hands, but in the heart. The boy began to listen. From that point forward, others came too. One settler asked what kind of mud worked best. Another wanted to see the frame. A woman with a newborn begged to sit inside for just 1 hour to warm her child's hands. He let her stay the night. The lodge that had once been a joke now became a question. And with every answer Wiketa gave through silence or through sharing, he wasn't just teaching how to build a hut. He was teaching how to surrender to the land and be shaped by it. It came without warning. No slow build of clouds, no gentle hush before the first flakes, just a wall of white that fell from the sky like the mountain had exhaled its soul. The wind howled sideways. Trees bent in place like old men bracing for a blow. Fires went out mid-meal. Doors flew open, and just like that, winter arrived like a war. The valley disappeared beneath the snow. By nightfall, the cabins were groaning. Roofs, heavy with ice, buckled. Smoke couldn't rise through clogged chimneys. Children coughed through freezing air inside rooms that no longer felt like shelter. Woodpiles vanished, paths blurred. The wind erased everything that wasn't buried or tied down. Inside Weketa's hut, the world was different. The rounded walls held the storm at bay. The vent above the fire drew the smoke smooth and true. Heat swirled gently within, warmed by the thick, breathing mud that curved like the inside of the earth itself. He lay near the coals, eyes open, listening not with fear, but with reverence. This wasn't chaos, it was nature's cleansing. Then came the knock. Not a fist, just a thud, then another and another. He opened the hide flap. 2 settlers stood there, the young couple from the collapsed cabin, their baby wrapped tight, their faces hollow from cold. Behind them, more shadows emerged. Families, children, men who once mocked, now with frost in their beards and tears in their eyes. Weketa stepped back without a word. They filled the space, knees to the ground, backs to the wall. Some wept quietly. Others just breathed for the first time in hours. The fire pit flickered against so many eyes. He handed out bark bowls, poured hot broth, placed extra furs around the baby. No one spoke of the past. The storm raged outside. The wind screamed and begged to be let in. But inside the hut, that simple, humble dome, they once ridiculed the people of the valley finally understood. Warmth wasn't in the size of the building, it was in the way it listened to the land. The mud didn't crack, the dome didn't groan. No beams needed bracing, no chimneys caught fire. Just silence, smoke, and survival. By morning, 5 cabins had collapsed. The others were half buried. But Weketa's hut stood untouched, a quiet heart, beating steady in a world frozen stiff, and those who had once laughed now asked if they could learn, not copy, learn. Because what they had witnessed that night wasn't just a clever trick, it was a relationship with the cold, with the ground, with the ancestors who once survived by shaping homes that didn't fight the season but flowed with it. And from that morning on, Weketa was no longer the man in the mud hut. He was the man who remembered. It began with a question, not shouted across a field, not whispered behind a door, but spoken plainly, with cracked lips and open eyes. The boy, the same one who once pressed snow into mud behind his broken cabin, stood before Weketa at dawn and asked, "Will you teach me?" Weketa didn't answer right away. He studied the boy's hands, blistered from frostbite, calloused now from effort. These were not the hands of someone looking to imitate. These were hands asking to remember something they'd never been told. So Weketa nodded once, and the lessons began. But there were no diagrams, no tools passed around or lectures shouted over wind. The first thing Weketa gave him was silence. He took him to the river's edge where the thaw had begun, showed him how the soil changed in the cold, how it held or slipped depending on touch. They gathered reeds, not for the structure yet, but to feel their bend. If it snaps, Weketa said, it wasn't meant to stay. Then came the clay. He showed how to soak it, knead it with straw, shape it by foot and hand, not to dominate it, but to listen for when. It told you it was ready. You don't command the wall, he explained. You raise it like a child. Others watched from a distance. Then, one by one, they joined. A mother who had slept beside her newborn in Weketa's hut now carried bundles of grass to be dried. An old trapper who had once mocked the roundness of the dome now spent an afternoon just learning to twist cordage tight enough to hold willow frames together. Soon, the clearing behind the ruined cabins became a school of dirt and breath. Waketa didn't speak often, but when he did, the words carried weight like snowpack before the melt. Build low, build wide. Let the storm flow over you. Don't seal it shut, let it breathe. Fire is not for fighting cold. It is for dancing with it. As the days stretched longer and the thaw deepened, the frames began to rise, not square and stiff like the old cabins, but curved, soft, patient. At first the settlers tried to rush, tried to skip steps. Every time they did, the mud cracked. And every time Waketa would only say, "You cannot rush what must hold still in the storm." They learned, they failed, they began again. And in their struggle, a strange peace grew not just between them and the earth, but between each other. By the end of that moon, 5 new domes dotted the valley smaller than Waketa's, uneven, imperfect, but alive. And when the next snow came, they did not fear it. They waited for it. Because now they were part of something older than cabins. They were part of the land. He arrived just after the first spring melt, riding a mule and wearing a coat stitched from wolf and elk. His beard was white as frost, his eyes sharp like obsidian, and his name was spoken in the valley with a strange mix of awe and wariness. The Mountain Man, they called him. He hadn't come down in 3 winters. He'd built his own cabin high above the tree line, alone with traps, rifles, and a reputation carved from stories. The kind where men survive on snowmelt and rabbit bones and don't flinch when cougars cross their path. But now, here he was, standing before Waketa's dome, arms folded. "Word traveled," he said, voice low and even, "said your hut made it through all 6 storms without a scratch." Waketa didn't answer, just handed him a bowl of cedar broth. The man took it, sipped, and nodded. "Not bad," he grunted, "better than squirrel soup." Then he walked around the lodge, slow and deliberate, running his hand along the mud wall. "Strange. Most men build up when they're afraid. You built down. Why?" Waketa glanced at the sky. "Because storms come from above." The old man chuckled. "You're not wrong." He stayed 3 days, didn't say much, just watched. Watched the settlers gather reed and clay. Watched the domes rise like brown mushrooms across the thawing valley. Watched the children play around the fire pit in the center of Waketa's lodge, where no sharp corners waited to trip or bruise. On the second night, he asked Waketa, "How'd you learn?" Waketa looked into the flames. "My mother's father, and his mother's mother, all the way back." The old man nodded slowly, like the wind had whispered that answer to him once too, but he'd forgotten it until now. "I built my cabin to fight the snow," he said. "Shotgun by the door, roof thick as a buffalo's back, still lost it to an avalanche 2 winters ago. Had to dig myself out with a deer antler." He laughed, but there was no pride in it. "Maybe I should have built with mud." Waketa passed him a second bowl of broth. "No one's too old to remember what works." Before the man left, he stood beside one of the new domes, a crooked one, built by settlers, still learning the patience it required. He touched the wall, tested the breath inside, listened to the silence. Then he turned to Waketa. "You've done something here." Waketa looked up. "I only remembered." The man nodded. And for the first time in many seasons, a man from the mountain rode away, not with game, not with pelts, but with an idea, not to conquer the land, but to listen to it, and carry it home in the shape of mud and wisdom. It started with warmth, not the kind that welcomes spring, but the kind that tricks it. The kind that comes too fast, too early, melting snow that should have stayed frozen for many more suns. The creek swelled, first a little, then more, then all at once. The ice cracked like thunder. The current turned brown, wild, alive, and the valley wasn't ready. Cabins near the low ridge were the first to go water, rising through the floorboards, sweeping out food barrels, ripping off doors. A fence disappeared like paper. A wheelbarrow floated by upside down. Families screamed through the sludge, trying to save what couldn't be held. But the domes held. Their walls, wide and rounded, let the water move around them like stone in a river. Their floors, dug low but packed tight, didn't swell or rot. Fires stayed lit. Children stayed dry. Inside Weketa's lodge, the smoke curled just as it had during the blizzard moon, calm, steady, patient. That day, people didn't ask to enter. They ran. Weketa opened his door and didn't close it again until the sun set. The dome was full settlers clutching babies, soaking wet, cheeks streaked with mud. The boy who once laughed now held his mother's hand like it was the last branch on a cliff. An elder who used to spit when he passed Weketa's home now sat trembling beside the fire, whispering prayers. No one spoke of cabins, only survival. The sound of the flood outside was like breathing through thunder, but inside they breathed together, shallow at first, then deeper. The fire was the only voice. When the water finally pulled back, the valley was changed. Fences gone, roofs split, wagons half buried in silt, but the domes still stood. All of them. One leaned slightly from the current's push, but it held. Another had its outer layer stripped away, but the frame endured. Weketa walked among them that evening, touching the walls like a father checking on his children. The settlers followed him not to gawk this time, to learn. How did it not flood? One asked. Why didn't it fall? What did we miss? Weketa paused beside the boy's dome, the one built after the first blizzard, where the frame had sagged and cracked until he learned how to listen. He turned to the crowd and said softly, "You built walls to keep the world out. I built mine to hold the world gently." They didn't understand right away, but they felt it. Felt it in their feet, standing on land still wet with memory. Felt it in the breath of the domes, still warm while their homes lay in ruin. Felt it in the way Weketa didn't boast, didn't scold. He simply stood, and now so did they. That spring, the valley looked different, not because the mountains moved, or the trees changed, or the sun forgot its path, but because the people within it had softened. The sharp lines of their cabins no longer pointed with pride. The laughter that once rolled toward Weketa's dome had turned inward, quieter. It was the laughter of people who had tasted humility and found it nourishing. The new buildings told the story best. Domes. Not just copies of Weketa's, but adaptations, evolutions, each shaped by the hands of those who built them, yet carrying the same breath, walls curved with care. Fire pits dug low and central, roof vents shaped to draw out the smoke like a song. Even the cabins that remained standing now bore signs of change. Earth packed against lower walls, willow frames reinforcing corners, straw mixed into seams. One morning, Weketa woke to the sound of children singing near the creek. They were building, but not cabins, not forts. Small domes of their own, with reed skeletons and thick mud, fingers stained with learning. They were shaping the future with the wisdom of the past, even if they didn't know the names of those who first gave it. He watched from the ridge, arms folded. Naomi, the settler woman with the baby now walking, laughing joined him. "Never thought I'd see our valley round like this," she said. Weketa nodded. "Sharp things break easier." She looked at him. "Thank you." He didn't reply. Gratitude wasn't something you held on to. It was something you passed along like fire, like seeds. That summer, the harvest was good, the storms lighter. The valley breathed in new rhythm. The domes weren't just homes anymore. They were symbols of survival, of surrender, of choosing to live with the land, not against it. And still, Weketa's lodge stood at the heart, not the biggest, not the most beautiful, but the first. One evening, as the sun dropped low and the mountains glowed gold, a young girl approached him with a strip of wet bark and a question in her eyes. "How do I make mine stronger?" He smiled. "Listen." "To what?" "To everything." She sat beside him. And together they watched the wind move across the grass, not to chase it, not to trap it, but to feel how it curved, where it paused, how it touched the world and taught without speaking. Because that was the final lesson. You do not conquer the valley by standing tallest. You do it by learning its shape and changing yours to match. Years passed. Children grew into hunters. Settlers became neighbors. Domes became the new normal. And still, Weketa's lodge remained not untouched by time, but honored by it. The once smooth walls were now veined with moss. The smoke vent had narrowed with seasons of soot. The entrance flap had been mended a dozen times by careful hands. But it stood, it breathed, it remembered. Waketa, older now, walked slower. His hands no longer pressed mud the way they used to, but his voice carried more than it ever had. He was no longer the man in the mud hut. He was the one they brought their questions to when the snow came early or the creek began to swell. And he always answered the same way. Don't fight the season, become it. Then one autumn, Waketa lay down near the fire and did not rise. He left no possessions, just warmth in the earth and stories in the walls. The villagers came quietly, one by one. No one spoke above a whisper. Children sat outside his dome, fingers tracing spiral patterns into the dirt. The men and women who once mocked him now built him a fire from his favorite wood, cottonwood, slow-burning, soft-scented. They kept it lit for 4 days. On the 5th, they decided together no one would live in Waketa's dome again. It became sacred. They patched the walls, reclayed the roof, placed feathers in the smoke vent, and deer antlers at the doorway, not as decoration, but as memory. A reminder of the man who taught them how to live by the land's rhythm, not man's schedule. And then came the winters, one after another, harder than before. Cabins, the few that still remained, fell. New domes cracked when built too fast. Floods tested the ground, again. But Waketa's dome never moved, never bent, never begged. It stood, long after those who built after him were gone, long after the stories faded from daily conversation, until all that remained was the dome itself, half covered in vines, sunken slightly, but still breathing through the hole in its crown. One spring, a traveler passed through the valley, young, curious, and quiet. He asked an elder, "Who lived there?" The elder smiled. "No one." "Then why keep it?" The elder touched the earth beside the dome. "Because it kept us."